The rain was coming down hard at Los Angeles International Airport as Keanu Reeves walked through the bustling terminal, his worn leather jacket slightly damp from the storm outside. He moved quietly through the crowd, his baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Most people rushed past him without a second glance, too caught up in their own travel troubles to notice the famous actor in their midst. At 48 years old, Keanu had learned to appreciate these moments of anonymity. After decades in Hollywood, he had mastered the art of blending in. Tonight was no different. He was just another tired traveler trying to catch a late flight to New York for a charity event that meant everything to him. The airport was in chaos. A massive storm system had swept across the West Coast, grounding dozens of flights and stranding thousands of passengers. The departure boards flickered with delay after delay, and frustrated voices echoed throughout the terminals. Keanu checked his phone. His flight was still showing on time, which seemed like a miracle given the circumstances. He approached the first-class check-in counter with his ticket in hand. The airline employee, a young woman named Sarah, looked up from her computer screen with the practiced smile of someone who had been dealing with angry passengers all day. Her name tag read, Customer Service Representative, and the dark circles under her eyes suggested she had been working overtime to handle the storm-related disruptions. "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" Sarah asked, her voice professional despite her obvious exhaustion. Keanu handed over his ticket and passport. "Just checking in for the New York flight," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the airport noise. Sarah scanned his documents and began typing on her computer. Everything seemed routine until her screen flashed red. She frowned, tried again, and got the same result. Her expression shifted from tired professionalism to confusion. "I'm sorry, sir, but there seems to be an issue with your reservation," she said, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she tried to resolve whatever problem had appeared on her screen. Keanu waited patiently, watching other passengers argue with airline staff about their own delayed or canceled flights. He had seen enough airport drama in his lifetime to know that getting upset rarely solved anything. The charity event he was flying to was important. It was raising money for children's hospitals. But he also understood that sometimes travel plans fell apart through no one's fault. "What kind of issue?" he asked gently, leaning forward slightly to hear her better over the airport's din. Sarah's frown deepened as she stared at her screen. "It says here that your first-class seat has been revoked, but that doesn't make sense. I've never seen anything like this before." She looked up at him apologetically. "Let me call my supervisor. This has to be some kind of system error." The word revoked hung in the air between them. Keanu had purchased his ticket weeks ago through the airline's website, paying the full price like any other customer. He had his confirmation number, his receipt, and his boarding pass was supposed to be waiting for him at check-in. Nothing about this situation made sense. As Sarah picked up her phone to call for help, Keanu noticed a small crowd beginning to form behind him. Other passengers were growing impatient, checking their watches and muttering about their own urgent travel needs. The storm had put everyone on edge, and tempers were running short throughout the airport. "This is ridiculous," complained a man in an expensive suit who was third in line. "Some people think they can just hold up the entire line with their problems." Keanu glanced back at the growing line and felt a familiar discomfort. He had never liked being the center of attention, especially when it might inconvenience others. The charity event was important, but so were all the other travelers trying to reach their own destinations. Sarah finished her brief phone conversation and looked up at Keanu with an expression that mixed embarrassment with determination. "My supervisor is coming over right away. Mr." She paused, looking down at his passport. "Mr. Reeves, I want to assure you that we're going to get this sorted out. This type of error is completely unacceptable." For the first time, Sarah really looked at the man standing in front of her. Something about him seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place where she might have seen him before. His calm demeanor in the face of this frustrating situation was unusual. Most passengers would have been demanding to speak to managers by now. The supervisor, a stern-looking woman in her 50s named Margaret, approached the counter with quick, efficient steps. She had been dealing with storm-related problems all day, and the last thing she needed was another complicated situation. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her expression suggested she had little patience left for difficult passengers. "What's the problem here?" Margaret asked briskly, not bothering with pleasantries. Sarah explained the situation while Margaret took over the computer terminal. After a few minutes of typing and clicking, Margaret's expression grew even more serious. She picked up the phone and made a quiet call that neither Keanu nor Sarah could hear clearly. When she hung up, Margaret looked directly at Keanu for the first time. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while we resolve this issue. There appears to be some kind of security flag on your reservation." The words security flag caused a ripple of whispers among the passengers in line. Suddenly, what had seemed like a simple computer error was beginning to look like something much more serious. Margaret's words sent a chill through the air around the check-in counter. A security flag meant trouble, and everyone within earshot knew it. Keanu felt the eyes of nearby passengers turning toward him, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity to suspicion. In a post-9/11 world, anything related to airline security made people nervous. "A security flag?" Keanu asked quietly, his voice remaining calm despite the growing tension. "I'm not sure I understand what that means." Margaret's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing her own confusion about the situation. In 23 years of working for the airline, she had seen plenty of security issues, but they usually involved passengers who fit certain profiles or had obvious red flags in their travel history. The man standing before her seemed like the least threatening person in the entire airport. "Sir, I'm going to need to see additional identification," Margaret said, following protocol even though she was clearly puzzled by the whole situation, "and I'll need you to step over to our security desk while we sort this out." Behind Keanu, the line of waiting passengers had grown longer and more restless. The man in the expensive suit was now openly complaining about the delay, and several other travelers were checking their phones anxiously, worried about missing their own flights. The storm had already caused enough problems. Without this mysterious security issue adding to the chaos, Sarah watched from behind the counter as Keanu calmly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license and credit cards without any of the protest or anger that Margaret usually encountered when dealing with flagged passengers. His quiet cooperation was almost more unsettling than outright hostility would have been. As Margaret examined his identification, her computer screen continued to flash warning messages that made no sense in the context of the man standing before her. The system was treating him like a potential threat, but everything about his behavior suggested the opposite. He was patient, polite, and completely cooperative, not exactly the hallmarks of someone planning anything dangerous. "Mr. Reeves, how long have you been a customer with our airline?" Margaret asked, trying to gather more information that might help explain the computer's strange behavior. "About 15 years, Keanu replied. "I fly with you folks pretty regularly for work. Never had any problems before." Margaret nodded and made a note on her screen. 15 years of flying with the same airline without incident should have been enough to clear up any computer glitch, but the security flag remained stubbornly in place. She made another phone call, this time speaking in low tones to someone higher up in the airline's security department. While Margaret was on the phone, Sarah found herself studying Keanu more carefully. There was definitely something familiar about him, but she couldn't quite place what it was. He had the kind of face that seemed like it should be recognizable, but without the context clues that usually helped people identify celebrities, she was drawing a blank. "Excuse me," said a young woman who had been waiting in line behind the businessman. "Is everything okay up there? My grandmother is waiting for me in New York, and if I miss this flight, I won't be able to see her before her surgery tomorrow." The woman's words reminded everyone in the terminal that real people with real problems were being affected by this mysterious delay. Keanu turned toward her with a sympathetic expression. "I'm really sorry about the holdup," he said sincerely. "I'm sure they'll get this sorted out quickly so everyone can get where they need to go." His genuine concern for the other passengers caught Sarah off guard. Most people in his situation would be focused entirely on their own problems, but he seemed more worried about the inconvenience he was causing others. She had been working in customer service long enough to recognize genuine kindness when she saw it, and this man had it in abundance. Margaret finished her phone call and returned to the counter with an expression that mixed frustration with bewilderment. "Mr. Reeves, I've spoken with our security department and they're just as confused as we are. The flag in our system appears to be legitimate, but no one can explain what triggered it or why it was placed on your account." The situation was becoming increasingly surreal. Security flags weren't random. They were placed for specific reasons by specific people or systems. The fact that no one could explain this particular flag suggested either a serious computer error or something more complicated that no one wanted to discuss openly. "What does this mean for my flight?" Keanu asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "Unfortunately, until we can resolve this security issue, I cannot allow you to board the aircraft," Margaret said, clearly unhappy about having to deliver this news. "I'm going to have to ask you to wait while we contact our main security office to get this straightened out." The businessman in the expensive suit had heard enough. "This is absolutely ridiculous," he announced loudly. "One person's problems shouldn't hold up an entire flight. Why don't you just move him to the back of the line and deal with the rest of us?" Several other passengers murmured in agreement, their patience finally exhausted by the delay. Sarah could see that the situation was starting to escalate, and she worried that things might get ugly if they didn't find a solution soon. Airport tensions were already high because of the storm, and this mysterious security issue was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Margaret raised her hand to quiet the growing complaints from the line. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your frustration, but I need everyone to remain calm while we resolve this issue. Sarah will continue processing other passengers while I work on the security matter." As Sarah began checking in the next passenger, she kept glancing over at Keanu, who was now standing off to the side near the security desk. He had pulled out his phone and was making a quiet call, probably to whoever was expecting him in New York. Even from a distance, she could see the disappointment on his face, though he was trying to hide it. Something about the whole situation didn't feel right to Sarah. In her 3 years working for the airline, she had processed thousands of passengers, and she had developed a pretty good sense for spotting potential troublemakers. The man they had just flagged for security reasons seemed like one of the least threatening people she had ever encountered at work. 20 minutes had passed since Keanu was asked to step aside, and the situation seemed to be getting worse rather than better. Margaret had made 3 more phone calls, each one longer and more intense than the last. Meanwhile, Sarah had processed dozens of other passengers, all while stealing glances at the man who remained patiently waiting near the security desk. The storm outside was getting worse, and airport staff were beginning to announce potential flight cancellations over the intercom. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that while Keanu was being prevented from flying due to a mysterious security flag, Mother Nature might end up grounding everyone anyway. A new player entered the drama when James Patterson, the airline's regional security coordinator, arrived at the gate. James was a former TSA supervisor who took his job very seriously, and he approached every potential security threat with the assumption that the system was right and the passenger was wrong. He had built his reputation on being thorough, sometimes to a fault. "Which passenger are we dealing with?" James asked Margaret in a voice loud enough for nearby travelers to hear. Margaret nodded toward Keanu, who was still standing quietly by the security desk, scrolling through his phone. To James, the man looked ordinary enough, medium height, dark hair, wearing jeans and a leather jacket that had seen better days. Nothing about his appearance screamed security threat, but James had learned not to trust appearances. "Mr. Reeves," James called out in his official security voice, "I need to speak with you about the flag on your account." Keanu walked over with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. James was immediately struck by the man's composure. Most passengers in this situation were either angry or nervous, but this guy seemed almost zen-like in his acceptance of the circumstances. "I understand there's some kind of computer error with my reservation," Keanu said politely. "I'm happy to provide whatever information you need to get it cleared up." James consulted his tablet, scrolling through screens of information that apparently made the situation even more confusing. "Mr. Reeves, according to our system, you were flagged 3 hours ago by our automated threat assessment program. The problem is, none of the criteria that usually trigger these flags seem to apply to you." This was news to everyone, including Margaret, who had been told that no one could explain the flag's origin. The revelation that it had been generated by an automated system opened up new possibilities and new concerns about what might have gone wrong. "What kind of criteria usually triggers these flags?" Keanu asked, genuinely curious about how he might have inadvertently ended up on a security list. James hesitated before answering. He wasn't supposed to discuss the details of the airline's security protocols with passengers, but the unusual nature of this case seemed to call for some flexibility. Typically, we see flags for things like unusual travel patterns, last-minute bookings, or connections to other flagged individuals. But none of that applies to your situation. Sarah had been listening to this conversation while continuing to process other passengers, and she was becoming more convinced that something was seriously wrong with the airline's computer system. She had seen plenty of technical glitches over the years, but nothing quite like this. The young woman, who was worried about her grandmother's surgery, approached the group. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly, "but I couldn't help overhearing. I work in IT for a tech company, and what you're describing sounds like it could be a case of mistaken identity. Sometimes automated systems can flag the wrong person if there are similar names or other data matches." James looked annoyed by the interruption. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but airline security is a bit more complex than typical IT problems." The woman wasn't deterred. "I understand that, but I've seen similar issues with other automated systems. Has anyone verified that the flag is actually intended for this specific Mr. Reeves? I mean, it's not an uncommon name." Her question hung in the air, and Sarah could see that it had given James something to think about. In all the confusion about why Keanu had been flagged, no one had considered the possibility that the flag might be intended for someone else entirely. "That's actually a very good point," Margaret admitted. "James, is there a way to check if there are other individuals with similar names in the system?" James was clearly uncomfortable with conducting this kind of investigation in front of an audience of passengers, but he was also beginning to suspect that they might be dealing with a case of mistaken identity. He began typing on his tablet, searching through databases that contained thousands of names and travel records. After several minutes of searching, James's expression began to change. "Well, this is interesting," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "What did you find?" Margaret asked. James looked up from his tablet with a mixture of embarrassment and relief on his face. "There is another individual with a very similar name who was supposed to be flagged today. K.R. Reeves, first initial K, middle initial R, last name Reeves. Our passenger here is Keanu C. Reeves." The revelation that the security flag had been intended for someone else entirely sent a wave of murmurs through the nearby passengers. After nearly an hour of confusion and delay, the mystery was finally starting to unravel. "So this whole thing was just a computer error?" Sarah asked, speaking up for the first time since the security team had arrived. "It appears so," James admitted, though his professional pride was clearly bruised by the mistake. The system must have matched on the last name and first initial and flagged the wrong passenger. It's not supposed to happen, but occasionally there are glitches in the matching algorithms. Keanu listened to this explanation with the same patience he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. While everyone else was focused on the technical details of how the error had occurred, he was thinking about the other passengers who had been delayed because of the confusion. "So I can get on the flight now?" he asked simply. James nodded, already beginning to input the corrections that would remove the flag from Keanu's account. "Yes, sir. I apologize for the inconvenience. We'll get you checked in and on your way to New York right away." But as James worked on clearing the security flag, a new problem emerged that no one had anticipated during the hour they had spent resolving the mistaken identity issue. Margaret's face went pale as she stared at her computer screen. While James had been working to clear the security flag, she had been trying to reinstate Keanu's original first-class seat. What she found made her stomach drop. "Oh no," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the airport noise. "What's wrong now?" James asked, looking up from his tablet where he had just successfully removed the security flag from Keanu's account. Margaret turned her screen so James could see what had happened. During the hour they had spent resolving the security issue, the automated systems had continued running their standard protocols. When a first-class passenger's reservation was flagged for security reasons, the system automatically released their seat back into the general inventory. Keanu's first-class seat had been sold to someone else just 20 minutes ago. "The system sold his seat," Margaret explained, her voice tight with professional embarrassment. "When we flagged him for security, it triggered an automatic release protocol. I've never seen this happen before, but apparently it's designed to prevent security risks from holding premium seats." Sarah, who had been watching this drama unfold while continuing to check in other passengers, felt her heart sink. After everything this patient man had been through, he was now facing another obstacle that was entirely the airline's fault. Keanu absorbed this latest development with the same calm acceptance he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. "So the seat's gone?" he asked simply. "I'm afraid so," Margaret admitted. "The passenger who purchased it is actually checking in right now at the counter next to us." They all turned to look at the adjacent counter, where a wealthy-looking businessman was completing his check-in process with obvious satisfaction. He had paid full price for the last-minute first-class upgrade, and he was clearly pleased about securing such a premium seat on a storm-delayed flight. James realized that this new complication made the situation much more serious from a customer service perspective. A simple apology wouldn't be enough when their own system had created a cascade of problems that left a passenger stranded. "What are our options?" James asked Margaret, hoping there might be a solution that wouldn't require disappointing either passenger. Margaret had been scrolling through her system, looking for any available alternatives. "We have coach seats available, but obviously that's not equivalent to what Mr. Reeves originally purchased. The next flight with first-class availability isn't until tomorrow afternoon." "Tomorrow afternoon?" Keanu asked quietly. "That won't work for me. I have a commitment in New York tonight that I can't miss." For the first time since the ordeal began, Sarah heard real disappointment in his voice. Whatever was waiting for him in New York was clearly important, and the airline's mistakes were going to prevent him from getting there on time. The young woman who had suggested the mistaken identity theory was still standing nearby, and she couldn't help but speak up again. "Why don't you offer him the coach seat for tonight and a first-class ticket on tomorrow's flight as compensation? That way he can still make his commitment." James considered this suggestion, but airline policies weren't that flexible. "We can offer him a coach seat tonight, but our compensation policies don't typically cover that kind of upgrade for future flights." "What if I paid the difference for the coach seat tonight?" Keanu asked. "I understand this was a system error, but I just need to get to New York." Margaret looked confused by his offer. "Sir, you already paid for first class. We should be compensating you, not asking you to pay more money." "I don't care about the money," Keanu said simply. "I just need to be on that flight." His willingness to pay additional money for a lesser seat after being subjected to an hour of security delays struck everyone as remarkable. Sarah had processed thousands of passengers over the years, and she had never encountered anyone who responded to airline problems with such grace and flexibility. James was beginning to feel the weight of his department's mistakes. Not only had they flagged the wrong passenger, but their automated systems had created additional problems that left a clearly decent person in a difficult situation. "Mr. Reeves, let me see what I can do," James said, pulling out his phone to call his supervisor. "This situation is entirely our fault, and we need to find a solution that makes this right." While James made his call, Margaret continued searching her system for any other options that might help resolve the situation. Sarah kept glancing over at Keanu, who had remained standing patiently throughout this latest development. "I'm really sorry about all this," Sarah said to him during a brief lull in her check-in duties. "I've never seen anything like this happen before." Keanu smiled at her, and for a moment Sarah felt like she was looking at someone she should definitely recognize. "It's not your fault," he said kindly. "These things happen. I appreciate everyone trying to help work it out." His genuine kindness in the face of such frustration was starting to make an impression on everyone involved. Margaret had been working in customer service long enough to know that most passengers would have been furious by this point, demanding to speak to higher-level managers and threatening to never fly with the airline again. James finished his phone call and returned to the group with a slightly more optimistic expression. "I spoke with my supervisor, and we're authorized to offer you a coach seat on tonight's flight at no additional charge, plus a full refund of the difference between coach and first class. We'll also provide you with a first-class upgrade certificate for any future flight within the next year." It was a reasonable offer given the circumstances, but everyone could see that it still didn't fully address the problem. Keanu would be getting to New York in a coach seat instead of the first-class accommodation he had paid for, and there was no way to undo the hour of stress and uncertainty he had experienced. "That sounds fair," Keanu said, accepting the offer without any negotiation or complaint. "When does boarding start?" Margaret checked her screen. "In about 30 minutes, assuming the weather doesn't get any worse." As if summoned by her words, a loud announcement echoed through the terminal. "Ladies and gentlemen, Due to deteriorating weather conditions, we are experiencing additional delays for all departing flights. Please monitor the departure boards for updates on your specific flight. The announcement sent a ripple of groans and frustrated sighs throughout the terminal. After everything they had been through to get Keanu onto the flight, Mother Nature was threatening to ground everyone anyway. The weather delay announcement changed everything. Within minutes, the gate area was flooded with passengers trying to get information about their flights. The departure boards were updating constantly, showing delay after delay as the storm system intensified over the West Coast. Sarah found herself overwhelmed with questions from anxious travelers, all wanting to know if their specific flight would be canceled. Margaret and James were fielding calls from their supervisors, trying to coordinate response plans for what was shaping up to be one of the worst weather delays of the season. In the midst of all this chaos, Keanu quietly found a seat in the waiting area and pulled out his phone to make some calls. Sarah could see him speaking earnestly to someone, presumably explaining that he might not make it to New York after all. Even from a distance, she could tell that whatever he was missing was important to him. About 15 minutes after the delay announcement, a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, approached Keanu's seat. The child was traveling alone, wearing the special lanyard that identified him as an unaccompanied minor, and he looked nervous about the flight delays. "Excuse me, mister?" the boy said quietly. "Are you worried about the storm too?" Keanu looked up from his phone with a gentle smile. "A little bit," he admitted. "But the pilots are really smart, and they won't take off unless it's safe." "Are you flying by yourself?" The boy nodded. "I'm going to see my dad in New York. My mom put me on the plane, but now I'm scared it might get canceled and I'll be stuck here." "What's your name?" Keanu asked, setting his phone aside to give the child his full attention. "Tommy," the boy replied, settling into the seat next to Keanu without being invited. "My parents are divorced and I only get to see my dad on weekends. If I miss tonight's flight, I'll lose most of my time with him this week." Sarah watched this interaction from behind the counter, touched by the gentle way Keanu was talking to the worried child. She had seen plenty of adults who were uncomfortable around unaccompanied minors, but he seemed completely at ease with the boy. "Well, Tommy," Keanu said thoughtfully, "sometimes flights get delayed, but that doesn't mean they get canceled. The airline wants to get you to your dad just as much as you want to be there. They're just being extra careful because of the storm." Tommy seemed reassured by this explanation. "Are you going to New York too? Maybe we'll be on the same plane." "I hope so," Keanu replied. "I have something important to do there tonight, but even if I don't make it, there will be other chances. The most important thing is that everyone stays safe." Their conversation was interrupted by Margaret, who approached with an update about the flight status. "Mr. Reeves, I have some news about your flight." Keanu looked up expectantly while Tommy listened with obvious interest. "Are we going to be able to fly tonight?" Keanu asked. "The flight is still scheduled to depart, but it's been delayed by 2 hours, Margaret explained. "The storm is expected to start moving out of the area around midnight, so we should be able to get you to New York by about 3 in the morning. This news was both good and bad for Keanu. He would still make it to New York, but arriving at 3 in the morning would make it impossible to attend the charity event that had prompted his trip in the first place. Tommy, however, was thrilled. "We're still going to fly," he announced excitedly. "I'll still get to see my dad." Keanu smiled at the boy's enthusiasm, even though his own plans had been effectively ruined by the delay. "That's great news, Tommy. Your dad is going to be so happy to see you." As they talked, Sarah began to notice other passengers paying attention to their conversation. There was something about Keanu's interaction with the child that was drawing people's attention. His patience, his kindness, and his genuine interest in making the boy feel better about the travel disruption. An elderly woman sitting nearby leaned over and spoke to Keanu. "That's very kind of you to talk to the young man. Not many people take the time to help nervous travelers these days." "Everyone gets worried when flights are delayed," Keanu replied simply. "It helps to talk through the concerns." The elderly woman studied his face more carefully. "You know, you look very familiar. Are you an actor or something?" Sarah's attention sharpened at this question. She had been wondering the same thing throughout this entire ordeal, feeling like she should recognize the patient man who had handled the airline's mistakes with such grace. Keanu seemed slightly uncomfortable with the direct question about his identity. "I work in the entertainment industry," he said diplomatically, clearly hoping to avoid making a bigger deal out of his presence at the airport. But the elderly woman's question had caught the attention of other nearby passengers, who began looking at Keanu more closely. A teenage girl sitting with her family suddenly gasped and pulled out her phone. "Oh my God," she whispered to her mother. "I think that's Keanu Reeves." Her whispered revelation rippled through the gate area like wildfire. Passengers began pulling out their phones, discreetly taking pictures and Googling images to confirm what they were seeing. Within minutes, the news had spread throughout their section of the terminal. Sarah felt her jaw drop as the pieces finally clicked into place. The familiar face, the calm demeanor, the genuine kindness. She had been helping Keanu Reeves all along and hadn't even realized it. Margaret, who was standing nearby when the teenager made her announcement, looked stunned. She quickly pulled out her own phone and did a quick search, confirming what everyone was beginning to realize. James, the security coordinator who had spent an hour investigating Keanu's security threat, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. He had just put one of Hollywood's most beloved actors through an hour-long security ordeal over a computer error. The atmosphere in the gate area began to change as word spread about who was sitting among them. Some passengers approached respectfully for autographs or photos, while others simply watched from a distance, amazed to find themselves sharing an airport delay with a major movie star. Through it all, Keanu continued talking to Tommy as if nothing had changed, helping the boy understand the flight delay and reassuring him that he would still get to spend the weekend with his father. The revelation of Keanu's identity sent shockwaves through the airline staff, who had been involved in the evening's drama. Sarah stared at her computer screen, remembering every interaction she had had with one of Hollywood's biggest stars, while Margaret and James exchanged horrified looks as they realized the magnitude of their department's mistakes. "We put Keanu Reeves through a security investigation," James whispered to Margaret, his face pale with embarrassment. "One of the most famous actors in the world, and we treated him like a potential terrorist because of a computer glitch." Margaret was already on her phone, calling her regional manager to report the situation before news of the incident could reach higher levels through other channels. The airline's public relations department would need to be involved, and damage control would have to begin immediately. Meanwhile, Keanu continued to handle his newfound recognition with the same grace he had shown throughout the entire airport ordeal. He signed autographs for the passengers who approached him politely, posed for a few photos, but always made sure to return his attention to Tommy, who was becoming increasingly excited about having a famous friend. "Are you really in movies?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide with wonder. "I am," Keanu confirmed with a smile. "Do you like movies?" "I love action movies," Tommy exclaimed. "My dad and I watch them together when I visit him." "Have you ever been in any good action movies?" The question made several nearby passengers chuckle, since Keanu was famous for some of the biggest action franchises in movie history. But he answered Tommy's question seriously without any hint of condescension. "I've been in a few," he said. "Maybe you and your dad have seen some of them. What are your favorites?" As they talked about movies, Sarah found herself watching the interaction with new eyes. She had processed thousands of passengers over the years, including several celebrities, but she had never seen anyone handle unexpected attention with such genuine warmth and humility. An airline executive named David Chen arrived at the gate about 30 minutes after Keanu's identity became known. David was the regional customer service director, and he had been hastily summoned to personally address what was shaping up to be a potential public relations disaster. David approached Keanu with the kind of nervous energy that executives display when they know their company has made a serious mistake involving someone famous. He had prepared an elaborate apology during his rush to the airport, but when he actually met Keanu, he was struck by how relaxed and approachable the actor seemed. "Mr. Reeves," David began formally, "I'm David Chen, the regional director for customer service. I want to personally apologize for the completely unacceptable treatment you received tonight. Our security systems failed, our staff made errors, and we put you through an ordeal that should never have happened." Keanu looked up from his conversation with Tommy, who was now showing him pictures on his phone of the movies they had been discussing. "Thank you for coming down here." "David, I appreciate the apology, but honestly, everyone has been trying their best to help once they figured out what went wrong." David was prepared for anger, demands for compensation, or threats of bad publicity. He was not prepared for genuine understanding and forgiveness. In his 15 years of handling customer service crises, he had never encountered a response quite like this one. "Sir, we want to make this right," David continued. "We're prepared to offer you a full refund for tonight's ticket, first-class accommodations on any future flight, and additional compensation for the inconvenience you've experienced." "That's very generous," Keanu replied, "but I'm more concerned about making sure this doesn't happen to other passengers. The computer error that flagged me could just as easily affect someone who doesn't have the resources to deal with it as calmly." His response left David speechless for a moment. Instead of focusing on his own compensation, Keanu was thinking about how the airline's systems could be improved to protect other travelers. It was a level of thoughtfulness that David rarely encountered in his line of work. Sarah, who had been listening to this conversation while continuing to process delayed passengers, felt a surge of respect for how Keanu was handling the situation. Even after being put through an hour of unnecessary stress, he was more worried about other people than about himself. The businessman who had purchased Keanu's original first-class seat approached the group. Having overheard enough of the conversation to understand what had happened, he was clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Excuse me," he said to David. "I'm the passenger who ended up with this gentleman's seat. If there's been a mistake, I'd be happy to give it back." David looked surprised by the offer. In his experience, passengers who had scored last-minute upgrades rarely volunteered to give them up, regardless of the circumstances. Keanu stood up to address the businessman directly. "That's incredibly kind of you to offer, but you paid for that seat fair and square. The mistake was the airline's, not yours. But you were here first," the businessman insisted. "And frankly, after hearing how you've handled this whole situation, I think you deserve that seat more than I do." The exchange attracted the attention of other passengers in the gate area, many of whom had been following the drama throughout the evening. A spontaneous round of applause broke out, acknowledging both the businessman's generous offer and Keanu's gracious response. Tommy, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Keanu, are you famous because you're nice to people?" The innocent question from the child caused laughter throughout the gate area, but it also captured something important about what everyone had witnessed that evening. They had seen a celebrity handle adversity with remarkable grace, putting the needs of others ahead of his own comfort and convenience. "I think people should just try to be kind to each other," Keanu told Tommy simply. "Famous or not famous, we're all just trying to get where we need to go." David realized that this incident, which could have been a public relations nightmare for the airline, was actually turning into something positive because of how Keanu had chosen to handle it. The other passengers were witnessing genuine kindness and humility from someone who had every right to be angry and demanding. "Mr. Reeves," David said, "would you be willing to accept the first-class seat? We can work out the details with the other passenger to ensure everyone is taken care of." Keanu considered the offer for a moment, then looked at Tommy. "Actually, I have a better idea. What if Tommy here gets the upgrade? I bet flying first class to see his dad would make this whole delay worth it." Tommy's eyes went wide with excitement. "Really? I could sit in first class?" "If it's okay with the airline and your dad," Keanu said, looking at David for confirmation. David nodded enthusiastically. "We can absolutely arrange that. Tommy, how would you like to fly first class to New York?" The boy's joy was infectious, and passengers throughout the gate area began smiling and clapping again. In a single gesture, Keanu had turned a frustrating travel experience into a magical adventure for a young passenger who would remember this night for the rest of his life. As boarding finally began for the delayed flight, Sarah watched Keanu walk toward the gate with Tommy, still talking about movies and adventures. She realized that she had witnessed something special that evening, not just a celebrity being kind, but a person choosing to make the best of a difficult situation and spreading that positive energy to everyone around him. The flight eventually took off 3 hours late, carrying passengers who had shared an unexpected adventure in the terminal. Tommy got his first-class seat. Keanu made new friends throughout the cabin, and everyone arrived in New York with a story they would tell for years to come. The charity event Keanu had been traveling to attend had ended hours earlier, but the kindness he had shown to fellow travelers that night proved to be more valuable than any fundraising gala could have been.